The heavy obsidian switch clicked beneath my primary claw with a sharp, greasy snap. The main displays of Facility 7 flickered, casting a stark white glow across the administrative platform. Below the viewing glass, elite cadets from multiple worlds stood inside the intake grid, waiting for the initialization countdown. Among the heavily armored warriors stood a single human female. She was 19 years old, lacked any external armor plating, and wore a gray training jumpsuit that looked far too large for her slight frame. The human asset will expire within 80 seconds of chamber ignition, Commander Vresh said, his heat-sensitive scales shifting to a bright blue as he tracked the digital wagers. I did not answer him. I punched the environment activation sequence directly into the secondary terminal. The training protocols were absolute. The gauntlet had a history of breaking soft species, and the last unshielded group we sent inside sustained a massive casualty rate in under 4 minutes. It was an institutional meat grinder, designed to filter out the fragile additions from the middle rim before deployment. Bets are officially closed, a communications officer said from the terminal behind me. The human did not look like a frontline recruit. She looked completely out of place as the massive titanium pressure doors dropped into their steel tracks with a heavy thud. Right before the pneumatic seals locked, she reached into her left utility pocket and pulled out a small, wrinkled rectangle of silver foil. She did not look up at the high-caliber thermal projectors warming the ceiling. She simply adjusted a small plastic hair tie around her left wrist, stepped through the entry frame, and waited. Would you have stood your ground when the air turned to liquid glass? Or would you have run? Stay close, because she didn't even move. 42 minutes before the ignition sequence, the intake yard had been loud with the sound of snapping joints and heavy gear. The elite cadets had spent the morning reinforcing their personal cooling systems. The giant crustacean warriors locked their heavy carapace joints to minimize internal friction, while the reptilian scouts tightened the valves on their external fluid bladders. Clara had done none of these things. She had spent the morning sitting on an empty supply crate, reading a handheld data slate and eating small pieces of dried fruit. Vresh had marked her file for immediate extraction, fully believing the fragile mammalian frame would suffer structural collapse during the primary atmospheric pressure drop. Chamber initialization complete, I announced through the open comms link. Ambient temperature rising to 98 degrees centigrade, atmospheric moisture reduced to 0. Survival protocol is now active. The air inside the main room shifted instantly, turning a thick, shimmering orange. The reptilian scouts dropped into low-profile hunting stances to conserve their internal water weight, their cooling valves emitting a series of wet clicks. The armored warriors stood perfectly still in the shade of the overhead intake vents. They knew how to handle the gauntlet. The rules of the forge required absolute stillness, minimal exertion, and a reliance on dense physical shielding until the primary timer ran out. The human broke the rules immediately. Clara walked directly toward the center of the room, ignoring the shaded safety zones entirely. She looked around the shimmering, heat-distorted space with a look of mild interest, her boots clicking softly against the reinforced floor tiles. In the exact center of the grid sat a flat boulder of volcanic basalt, a dense chunk of rock that was already radiating enough thermal energy to blister an unshielded hand. She stopped beside it, patted the surface with her palm, and sat down. She crossed her legs and leaned her back against the hot stone. Sensor malfunction, Vresh barked, his upper manipulators slamming against his console interface. Her vitals are completely flatline. The human is in a state of catatonic shock. Her neural pathways have frozen from the pressure jump. I looked at the infrared diagnostic overlay on my main screen. The data lines were perfectly steady. The internal monitoring system showed her heart rate sitting at a flat, unbothered pace, completely empty of the standard panic tremors that appeared in soft-skinned species under thermal threat. Her skin was turning a light pink color, and a thin, glistening layer of moisture was beginning to bead across her forehead. Her body was not failing. She was simply sitting in the center of a furnace, completely relaxed. With a small, deliberate twist of her fingers, she tore open the top seam of the silver foil bag. Tier 3 parameters, I commanded, pulling the secondary override lever down by 2 notches. Bring the internal atmosphere to 140 degrees. Activate the kinetic dust fans. A howling gale of superheated silica sand erupted from the lateral vents, cutting through the chamber like a plasma torch. The wind tore across the floor tiles, kicking up blinding clouds of reflective dust. Within 17 seconds, a reptilian scout let out a sharp hiss as his external cooling bladders split open under the sudden pressure drop. He collapsed onto the grid, and I hit the emergency release switch, letting the automated medical drones drag his heat-sick frame out through the floor hatches. The armored crustacean warriors were groaning now, their heavy plates expanding under the intense heat and grinding against their own joints. Clara did not look at the medical drones. She reached into the silver packet, pulled out a handful of small, hard yellow seeds, and dropped them into her lap. A sharp, crisp snap echoed through the audio receivers. Inside the heat-filled chamber, one of the yellow seeds turned completely inside out, expanding into a fluffy white cloud of starch. Then another snapped. Within seconds, a rapid, rhythmic series of small detonations filled the room, sounding like a tiny kinetic skirmish bouncing against the metal bulkheads. "What is that chemical reaction?" Vresh shouted, his secondary limbs stiffening as he leaned over the monitoring rail. "Is she preparing an improvised explosive device? Scan the thermal signature of that container immediately." I brought up the automated tactical analysis array, but the data drop made no sense. The scanner flagged the object as a simple domestic food ration from the Sol frontier freight lanes, registering the reaction as a basic thermal expansion of internal moisture. The device was not a weapon. The human girl reached down into her lap, picked up a single white starch cloud with 2 fingers, and tossed it into her mouth. She began to chew with a slow, steady rhythm that suggested absolute, unadulterated boredom. The ambient air was now hot enough to cook a standard military field ration, and she was using the lethal Deathworld simulator as a household kitchen utility. "Maximize the array," I said, my voice dropping into a raspy whisper as my thoracic breathing slits flared with a sudden, heavy hiss. "Take the system to Tier 9, 180 degrees. Let us see the absolute ceiling of this organism." The air inside Facility 7 stopped shimmering. It turned a deep, hellish magenta color as the primary power cores flooded the thermal grid. The remaining crustacean warrior let out a wet, gurgling roar as his knees buckled. His massive, heavy armor plates began to run fluid under the immense heat, dripping onto the floor tiles like warm wax before the emergency medical drones could slide across the sand to drag him toward the pressure lock. The gauntlet had become a scorched execution space, a graveyard of elite military ambition that could melt soft metals in seconds. Clara was completely covered in a fine layer of sweat now. The primitive, highly elegant evaporative cooling system of her ancestors was working at full capacity, dumping her internal heat into the dry air and keeping her core temperature perfectly stable within the firestorm. The small detonations in her lap began to slow down. She did not blink against the silica gale, nor did she lift her hands to shield her eyes from the blinding magenta glare. When a sharp shard of superheated rock flew directly toward her face, she simply shifted her skull by 3 centimeters, let the debris whistle past her ear, and reached back down into the silver foil bag for another handful of snacks. The automated monitoring console began to flash a bright crimson notice across my primary display screen. The system had run out of pre-programmed categories for a biological entity that grew more comfortable as the environment approached terminal toxicity. The tracking log simply read, "Strategic Threat Model Error." Clara finished the last piece of starch as the primary countdown clock hit the final 5 seconds. She balled up the empty silver foil bag into a tight, neat sphere, shoved it back into her right jumpsuit pocket, and stood up from the basalt block. She walked toward the heavy titanium exit doors before the hydraulic pressure seals had even begun to turn. The heavy valves slid open with a massive hiss of escaping steam, filling the main hub with a cloud of grey mist. Clara stepped out into the cool, air-conditioned hallway of the administrative center, her boots leaving small, damp prints on the polished floor. The surviving cadets, wrapped in blue thermal shock blankets and covered in thick medical gel, stared at her with a quiet, terrified reverence. The betting rings had completely vanished. No one spoke of numbers, and no one looked at the scoreboard. I walked down from the examiner's platform, my thoracic vents whistling softly with a mixture of profound physical exhaustion and deep tactical dread. "Cadet Clara," I said, my voice sounding rough against the cold air of the hub. "Your performance profile violates every established biological metric within this institution. Explain your complete lack of defensive movement during the maximum thermal spikes." The human girl stopped walking. She looked up at me, her small face completely clean of injury, save for 2 small streaks of dark soot across her left cheek. She blew a loose lock of brown hair out of her eyes with that soft, familiar puffing sound, then gave a small, humble shrug of her shoulders. "Oh, the room was just nice and cozy," Clara said, her voice completely calm. "My home planet has these places called saunas, so I am used to the heat. Plus, I usually get bored during these long endurance tests, so my dad gave me these corn packets before I deployed. They pop perfectly when things get hot enough. Saved me a trip to the base galley." She gave me a polite, slight nod, turned on her heel, and ambled down the long corridor toward the barracks, looking like a sleepy child heading for a routine nap after a long day of travel. I did not file the standard evaluation log that evening. Instead, I accessed the Central Coalition Registry, deleted the existing file markers for the Sol sector, and entered a complete, sweeping rewrite of our tactical defense metrics. I signed my own permanent transfer paperwork to an administrative post 3 galaxies away before the system could even finish processing her final score. The empty, grease-stained silver foil bowl she left behind inside the storage container now sits inside our high-security specimen vault, mounted under a permanent anti-grav field. The automated display carries a new, official strategic entry, written in plain text for the next generation of commanders to read before they plan their deployments. "Strength that chooses gentleness is not weakness, it is wisdom."